What's up, guys? Welcome to another edition of Before the Whistle, presented by BRK Insurance Group. If your business is looking for the best in employee benefits, commercial property and casualty insurance, or retirement and 401k plan services, there's no one better suited to meet your challenges and build a plan centered around your needs than BRK Insurance Group. What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to Before the Whistle, and it's not exactly the anniversary of a year of the show, but again, I am your host, Maddy, and I am making this episode the anniversary episode of Before the Whistle with, I believe it was this last Friday, being a year since I started the show. And I just kind of wanted to do a state of this podcast, if you will. It's post-draft. I covered a lot of that going into draft weekend, if you will. And it was a very long weekend if you were a Tulane fan, especially having to kind of follow along until we saw Jaquan Jackson go in the 6th round, Michael Pratt in the 7th round, and then the guys that went all throughout undrafted free agency. And it really just goes to show you how quickly their lives change, where you look at the fact that Michael Pratt's already in Wisconsin on what I think is their 3rd or 4th day of rookie minicamp. And the draft, I think it was just last week, if not the week prior. It just goes to show you how quickly their lives really changed throughout all this. But now that's kind of where you simmer down a little bit. And it's more so like that in the NFL. But what I've really learned in a year of doing this show is just how much of a different beast college football is. When I started the show, I wasn't exactly sure where I wanted to go with it. And I'm going to kind of get into, why I ended up calling it Before the Whistle. But I knew that I obviously wanted to cover football. And being a sideline reporter for Tulane, I just felt like the perfect opportunity for me to be able to tell a lot of the stories that you otherwise just don't have the opportunity to. When you're doing an on-air broadcast, especially the sideline hits, it's not the time for narratives and storytelling and all of that. You're calling a live football game. And so it's very truncated, short type of coverage. But with all the time that we've spent around these guys and being through the last couple of seasons of Tulane football, witnessing them on the sideline the way that I have, it just has really been a pleasure of mine to be able to have this space to share this with you guys and feel like I am so much more comfortable when I think back to what I was doing sitting in this chair a year ago-ish from today. My family, who's also in town this week, which is why I didn't release a Friday episode, was also here when I was doing that first show. And I just remember how awkward it felt sitting down, looking at a camera and just kind of talking. Although I did find that the talking part came relatively natural to me. If you have been around since the beginning of the show and watched that intro episode, I talked about my unconventional background, getting into sports reporting, if you will, and being a theater kid growing up and having a little bit of child acting experience, not very much at all, but just having those kind of things, going to those classes, learning to speak in front of a camera, learning to get graded in front of other students, which was extremely cringe, but it really helps for these types of settings. And even still, I just think back to how much more natural I feel a year from now, just thinking back to, again, sitting down and doing that first episode. And it just goes to show how important reps are. I have all these mentors in this industry. Todd Graffinini is one I mentioned several times, and that was something he was always a high proponent of when I started coming into the sports industry, was getting those reps. And I actually had done a very small Saints podcast in, I think, 2020. Didn't really last that long, and the production was really difficult for me and just not really worth the payoff. But having that experience when this opportunity came around made it just feel slightly less daunting. And then the reason that covering Tulane this whole time has felt so special is because it's something that I think doesn't really have enough coverage, but it's something that I feel like I have such a special connection with, having the opportunity to go to school at Tulane, know what the culture was like there. Yes, I don't have the long-standing history of it. I am 30 years old, so I've only been alive for so much of Tulane football's history. But even just having my first 2 years as a student be in the Superdome, I really appreciate that I was able to get that exact split experience. So for people that never got to see Yeoman as a student, who probably have come back as alumni, I remember my dad came to a game last year and was really just blown away by the complete change in atmosphere than when it was when he came to a game my freshman year going to the Superdome. I mean, it was just sad. Tulane was not doing that well at the time, but it doesn't even matter when your school is 1/10 of the size of the Superdome's capacity. And that's if every single person showed up and then brought multiple family members. It just felt relatively hollow. And I missed the opening season of Yeoman. If you've caught a lot of my episodes with Sam Lockwood, Wave After Wave on Twitter, he was at Yeoman for its inaugural season. He can tell the tales about how that tailgating was, but everyone just seemed very burnt out by the time I got back from abroad and was able to go to Yeoman my senior year. Even still, the amount of games I went to that year were more than I did in my first 3 years prior. And, there was times where I'd want to go to games. It was just kind of hard to get people going and get people over there. That's really not a problem anymore. And to see Tulane be, making this student club where students actually took the time to vote on a name for it, and it comes with these perks, getting into games early, being proactive about that kind of stuff. It just goes to show how much momentum there's been in Tulane athletics and how different Tulane has been, the state of it really, since I took the job as a sideline reporter, where when I came in 2021, I had missed spring camp, so I wasn't able to see what that change, was like. But I come into the 21 year and I'm not used to being around these guys. I don't know the coaching staff. I don't know the players at all. And I really don't know how to cover football as a sideline reporter. Who had just started writing about the Saints the year prior to that, and it kind of made this segue into sports. And, as I talked with Corey, when I talked about taking the job, I can talk a lot about football. I know what I'm talking about. I've read, and that was, prior to doing the scouting academy for multiple courses at that and having the sideline view for the last few years. But I knew that I knew a lot about football. That still didn't mean that I really had any idea on how to be a sideline reporter. And it's a very outgoing job, as I've said before on the show. And it's something I want to dive into this offseason, being an introvert and having to kind of find your personality in a very extroverted sport, because I think that's a lot of the time what gets kind of overlooked when you're talking about football players. And some guys who might not be inclined to be leaders, they might be a leader. It's just not in the way that you're necessarily used to. And it takes a certain ability to kind of tune into it. But I always joke that I can kind of spot the fellow introverts because I am one. And depending on where you've met me, if you know me outside of work or if you only know me, in a social setting, it depends on whether or not people believe me when I tell them that I'm an introvert, because there's this misconception that, it is the same thing as being socially awkward or shy. And I certainly can be socially awkward. I'm not going to act like I'm not. And I do have an air of shyness to myself, but it's interesting. It's never really came across in a public speaking way whatsoever. All that roundabout way to say it's something that I wouldn't say I put a mask on, but ultimately, when I'm out and I'm talking with people, even if I am enjoying my time with them, it's still like an expending of energy. And that's really where you look at the difference between introverts and extroverts. Extroverts get their energy from being around other people, and introverts get their energy from taking their time to themselves. So, I was used to working office jobs and honestly closing my door most of the day and spending my time kind of in my own silence. And maybe it's a good thing to kind of push yourself out of your comfort zone. Maybe that's a takeaway from this, but it was a lot kind of coming in that first season and being a little out of my element. And I'm usually not someone to just kind of walk up to people and introduce myself. I hang back a little bit and just kind of observe. And so I've always been grateful to a lot of those players I've mentioned over these podcasts, Shaquan Jackson, Tajay Spears, Nick Anderson, for just being so outwardly forthcoming and welcoming, really all the guys on the team, Michael Pratt, as sincere. It was just immediately felt like it wasn't just my first day at work, even though it was. And then Hurricane Ida happens, and all of a sudden, my first game that's supposed to be at Norman Stadium, I think that's the name of it, in Oklahoma, whichever it's called, will be going back this year. But all of a sudden, it was extremely chaotic and kind of going over to Birmingham. Now, do we talk about this in our coverage? Obviously, we kind of have to. And then, the Oklahoma game, unfortunately, was probably the highlight of that season for Tulane. And so I learned very quickly what it was like to cover a team that is not doing well and not winning on a weekly basis. I've never really found any issue with that. I've almost said I enjoy breaking down losses a little more than I do breaking down wins. I kind of compare it to, the strategy my dad gave me for the GRE of just disagree with whatever the essay prompt is, because no one really wants to hear, well, yeah, that's a good point because of this, and that's a good point. And then also I agree with this kind of thing. Being able to dissect and analyze a little bit is something I think is slightly easier to do in a loss, but it's been very fascinating for me to have this space because, when I'm on the radio voice of the team, it's kind of a different hat. Whereas I'm still wearing that hat when I'm doing this podcast, but I can kind of sit back and look at things. When I'm doing sideline reporting, it's all off the cuff. It's all, immediate game analysis, observations, and maybe that's just how we run things. And it's probably a lot more the case in radio than it is in television, where especially if you're a national group and you don't know the team, then you're more likely going to kind of create those I'm sorry, my computer just went blank and I thought that it turned off on me. It's easy to hear a promo in the middle of a podcast and think, of course, they like the product, they're paid to. Well, if you know me at all and you've been listening to this episode, then you know two things. One, I'm truthful, almost to a fault. And two, if I were in it for the money, I'd certainly be doing something else. So believe me when I say that I love Blue Oak Barbecue and I love what's coming in the works for you guys this month with MJ, my favorite bartender over there. But the food, the drinks, the location, the people, yes, all of that. Blue Oak Barbecue has a great selection of your favorites from the smoker, fantastic sides, and awesome bar specials each and every week. So go check them out. Blue Oak Barbecue, located at 900 North Carrollton here in New Orleans, or visit them online at blueoakbarbecue.com. I am going to get those May specials coming for you all on next week's episode, but as posted on Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it, my mom, who is a very tough critic, her favorite drink, the lime daiquiri, is currently on sale at Blue Oak Barbecue. And I mean, it literally tastes like limeade, just the perfect refreshing on a summer day. And for someone that sometimes doesn't always want a margarita, it is like that perfect same kick without the tequila. So I would highly recommend going and getting one of those while I get you guys those specials on next episode. Would it be a Before the Whistle episode, and particularly the anniversary episode of Before the Whistle, without a little bit of oops, let's start this segment over. I don't know why my computer went quiet or went blank on me. I thought that it turned off and it didn't, alas. But talking again about what I really enjoyed about this space and how it really differs from my sideline coverage is, we're in real time and different from, as I was saying, TV broadcasts where they don't know the team. You have to come in and kind of get those storylines in advance just to have some narrative to go on during the game. Whereas we're really just kind of focused more on doing the in-game analysis and painting a picture, because on radio, you aren't able to see what's going on. And so, and especially if you're someone that's tuning into the local broadcast, assuming that you probably know a little bit more about the team, but it's a lot more what I do on the field is observations of actual football things that I see going on. And then I bolster that by having the ability to pop into these meetings or remember plays from the week, remember things that at the time, Coach Willie Fritz, which will now be John Summerall, told us during the week. I kind of bring that all back, but it is all completely improvisation. And then going up and hosting the post-game show, I mean, you have nothing to go off of other than what just happened on the field. Oftentimes, I'm still trying to kind of look at the final game stats. And as I've said before, the sideline view, it's so weird watching football down there. And I really realized that my first year that I almost don't know what happened half the time when I get up there. And so being able to sit down on here, be able to look at, not all the time film per se, but watch a game back on YouTube TV, chart the plays down, and then be able to give a little more of an bolstered analysis while, it's, yes, I'm looking at football and giving that type of analysis, but then that's where I can really tie back into all of the time that I've spent over at Tulane over the last couple of years. And so that's what's really made this space so special for me, and how I kind of naturally segued into talking about Tulane. And talking about why I wanted to call this show Before the Whistle. First of all, naming a podcast is very hard. If anyone out there has tried to do so, just trying to come up with a unique way to put what you're trying to do out there, where you first of all have to have an idea of what you're trying to do and then name it. Both of those being very difficult, challenging steps for me, where, okay, yeah, I want to cover football. Well, cool. So do so many other people out there. Do you want to cover a specific team? Do you want to cover the league as a whole? Do you want to go into a specific type of niche? And I'm still kind of exploring that. And I've explored that as the kind of natural seasons of football have done their ebbs and flows, where I think at this point, the majority of my following is Tulane fans, and I'm always going to continue to have that in my coverage. But I do enjoy this little off-season period where most people probably would not want to start a sports podcast about football in May, because there's nothing going on until about July or August. For me, that was really an opportunity to actually challenge myself, because I think it would have been quite easy to come on here and immediately start giving training camp updates, because I've done radio, I do all this stuff all the time. I do it in writing form, I do it in just multiple different avenues to where I can report on things relatively easily. But digging deep and actually providing something unique when there's nothing about football going on that's still about football at the same time was definitely a challenge. I've talked about this in a lot of episodes. I've been doing the Scouting Academy, something I'm still working through, and something that I found to be very just essential to my learning. And that has been the amount of books that I've had to read just to get a real grasp about what I'm trying to look at within these players. And a lot of the time, I just feel like some of these coaching seminars are the best way to get that idea about those things. So thinking back to kind of how I covered that last offseason, I was really kind of interested in looking at coaching trees. So looking at those kind of philosophies of coaches. What I really enjoyed about Tulane is change. Some people might not like it, but it has made it one hell of a story to tell season after season for me. And it makes it really relevant going into this offseason, where looking at mentors and looking at coaching changes and looking how a team buys in and the turnover of leadership. These were all questions that you could kind of ask about Tulane over the last couple of seasons, but you could hide behind Michael Pratt. You could hide behind Willie Fritz. You could hide behind 2-10 for that matter. I mean, for the years that I've covered Tulane, there's only been 1 year of expectations. I guess you could say the expectations for 21 were certainly higher than 2-10. They were coming off of a bowl game, off of Michael Pratt being a true freshman off the bench halfway, I think it was week 3 of that season, leading them to a bowl game. I caught a couple of his games on TV for that matter, because Todd Graffinini called me. That's how interesting Michael Pratt was, that he had me tune into my first probable game of Tulane football that I'd watched since I graduated. But they were coming off of that momentum, and yeah, it got completely quashed. But there was this legacy of Willie Fritz, I think, that was already there that gave some leeway. But I'll be honest, I remember everyone starting to hear that conference championship talk, and I was hearing it back in spring, as I've always continued to say. So by the time I got to July, I was like, all right, I believe you guys at this point. But it was really early back in February, March of that year. Those workouts are being conducted by Kurt Hester, who I've never met before, the new strength and conditioning coach. How do you really have that culture turnover? And the answer is a player-led team. It's something that John Sumrall, one of his final press conferences in the spring, said that he really needs someone on this team, guys on this team for that matter, to step up and have it be player-led, because that's ultimately, when you look at what happened in the greatest single season turnaround, you have to really look back to those captains, the way that they conducted themselves in that offseason, the way they all held each other accountable and bounced back from losses that could have made things go downhill really quickly. Again, coming after that Kansas State win that year and then falling to Southern Miss, it's really easy for the downhill slurry to start really quickly, as we saw in the 2-10 year. So for them to respond the way that they did and battle the adversity that they did in Houston with the quarterbacks going down and just coming back in overtime, everything they did that year. But that was, that was the identity of these adversity riddled fighters that throughout a hurricane and a 2-10 year had pulled off the greatest single season turnaround in college football history, beat the active Heisman Trophy winner in the wildest game possible, and then future NFL #1 overall draft pick in Caleb Williams. And then it was fascinating because that, I think, was the first time, quite honestly, in the 21st century that there's been real expectations for Tulane football. And so having this podcast last year, it felt just like a natural, perfect opportunity of, well, there's actually interest this time in Tulane's offseason. Where I just think back to, I don't think anyone attended the spring game in the Cotton Bowl year, and I don't really blame them just based on what the perception was, what the product was on the field the year prior. But seeing what the spring turnout was for this game, this last spring game under John Sumrall, it's really easy for a school to lose momentum with a coaching change. It's very rare for a team and a school to almost swing it so far in the other direction that the momentum just keeps going up. But I think that's really what you've seen under John Sumrall. And from my perspective, it has just been fascinating to storytell. So why I came into calling it Before the Whistle. What I'm doing the Scouting Academy, there's so much of the emphasis of it is on context and the idea that before you even start watching this film on this player, get their whole background on what they did in college, what their injuries were, what the schemes were like, all of that type of stuff. If they switch teams from last year, what type of base scheme were they in? I was looking at a defensive tackle that came over from a 3-4, and he kind of got edged out, not having that ability to play true nose tackle, goes over to another team, defensive tackle in a 4-3, then all of a sudden is able to produce. Well, you have to have that context and include that and explain it in a very digestible way. And when you look at something like an injury, there's a reason that we have to go back, look through all of that in college. And, depending on the specific games that you watch for a player, if you're watching a game in week 7 and they had an ankle injury in week 6 and it's a cornerback, well, you have to keep that in mind when you're grading that game on things like their athletic ability. And you have to keep it in mind that it might affect their mental processing, because players that know that they're not fully there physically oftentimes are going to overcompensate in one way or the other. Sometimes they get grabby. Sometimes they get overly aggressive. That would be me when I was an injured player. All of that to say, it really stuck out to me how much, when even I had been covering football and I thought I had been doing my due diligence, I just wasn't getting the full picture of a player. And, that it's a very intensive course. I'm not saying that that's the way you should approach all of your coverage or any of it, because it's ultimately up to you on what you want to do. But just with the amount that you have to really get on paper and understand about a player before you even start diving into his film at all, that to me is really where the crux of Before the Whistle has come from for me, where, I'm not Googling all these things. I'm getting to watch them all unfold in real time, where there's been 1 year where there's been a consistent defensive coordinator. Chris Hampton retained after the 2-10 year, stayed around for the Cotton Bowl year, then he went off to Oregon. That's the only coordinator that's been on either side of the ball for more than one season while I've been at Tulane. So while I've had that consistency of covering the quarterback and the head coach, there's still been quite a lot of change. And as I've gotten better at football, really having an opportunity to understand and appreciate what different coordinators can bring to the table. But when I first came in, I was really just going off of my instincts and my reads on people and how people interact with each other. And I just continue to remain grateful that even though I probably would have a little easier time getting into this industry if I had gone the more traditional path, coming from that psychology background just continues to remind me and cue me to think about just one extra thing before I put a thought out there, or is there some angle that I'm not considering? And I think in college football, more than the NFL, it just matters that much more to just be that extra thoughtful, especially again in the position that I'm in, being the sideline reporter, but really just in general, talking about these guys, where I think back to the draft weekend and how stressful it was watching it, just wondering where these guys go. I have no skin in this game. I truly can't fathom what it must feel like to be a player. I think everyone thinks that is like a dream come true for guys. I'll be honest. I think draft day for more guys is probably a nightmare. Just it's to not, unless you're someone that truly does not care where you end up, are really just at peace with whatever. Just again, the idea that it's all based on this random team off of team, where if one thing had gone differently, there's a strong chance you would have ended up somewhere completely different or on a team versus not, or vice versa. And suddenly, like I said, less than a week or about a week after the draft, Michael Pratt goes from Florida to Green Bay, Wisconsin, and their lives just change so quickly like that. But then I consider that is the crescendo of what I've been covering the entirety of their careers leading up to that event on draft day, where while they're in college, they're trying to win games. They're trying to go to the conference championship. They're also trying to achieve personal goals, team goals, all at the same time. And anyone that's played competitive sports knows, even though you can be a selfless player and be a team first, you can still want to play, the best that you want to do and be probably harder on yourself than other people are going to be. And it just makes it that much harder in today's age, where these guys are growing up in an era of social media that just did not exist for the longest time. And there's a lot of ways that it just has shown me that we receive information way too quickly nowadays, and probably too much of it. And like this recent rap beef, I'm not going to get into it because that is not a topic I want to touch, but the ability for us to mass receive and disseminate information, that to me was just this crescendo of, I don't feel like we were all meant to be going at this hyper of a speed, but that's just the way that technology flows. But you hear about and you see NFL players, NBA players getting a little I guess, petty, dramatic, pissed off, whatever you want to call it, online about what fans, haters, what have you, are saying. If the adults that are making millions of dollars playing the sport feel this way, how do you think the guys that are on the college level feel? And now they have guys in their ear about NIL and the transfer portal and conference realignment. It just has blown my mind how much I have to think about that. It's not even within my idea before the whistle, but just has to do with college football, with the transfer portal, which is something that is continuously going on for Tulane. I believe they just signed Derek Graham, an offensive tackle from Troy, to be the starting left tackle, which is great for Tulane and probably explains a little bit of the exodus that we've seen. But it is crazy that despite there really being no football going on right now, that there is breaking news in college football because of the transfer portal. It is very, very bizarre. And that's without even ever getting into the actual crux of what NIL looks like, what the transfer portal looks like, what these kind of agents that have absolutely no regulation look like. It is the Wild West in college football. And so I just feel like it is that much, you have to be just that much more responsible about what you're saying and putting out there, and just how much of an effect it can have on people's lives. What you say matters at the end of the day. But what I've also learned is it is weird. It's its own beast. The emotions are different in this sport. I can see the magic of college football and feelings that I felt watching Tulane win games that even as a Saints fan, it really does kind of hit different, especially as an alumni of the program. It's also just struck me that is so weird that I've had to spend considerable time on this podcast talking about point margin victory. Where when I've grown up playing sports, it never mattered what the final score was. It just mattered if we won or lost the game. And so rankings and the idea that your margin of victory and point differential would be the difference maker for you getting into the playoffs, still definitely something I'm wrapping my head around. This has been a very smorgasbord episode. I wasn't really sure where I was going to go with it, and I don't really know where I'm really going to end it now. But my first episode, I sat down and I mostly penned out what I was going to write, mainly because, as I said, I've never had done this before and sat down and spoke for a very long time. And you guys would have gotten a lot of ADHD brain runarounds and just complete losing my train of thought. It is not easy to sit down and talk for this long of a time period without that much experience. So for this one, I almost wanted to come in the exact opposite and just sit down and connect with you guys on a genuine human level. And it really works out that we are in this kind of downtime of the off season where I get to kind of look down at my notes, if you will, and look at what I've learned. Look at what I've learned about covering a sport, what I've learned about creating a podcast, structuring an episode. As I've said, things like eye contact and engaging with people. But just really kind of figuring out my own space in a very crowded sports podcasting industry. And I really feel like I found that home covering Tulane. But it just has been that much more special that I feel like I can also do exactly what I want to do with this show and talk about these bigger ideas, look at coaching trees, get to look at this offseason is going to be incredibly fascinating for Tulane people. And I think the interest is at an all-time high, at least since I have probably been alive or been aware of Tulane having a football team, I'll say. So that has just been a very special thing to do. But feeling like I actually can kind of find my passion in this industry. And it's not to say that I've completely figured it out. It's a very hard industry to get in, stay in. And, we see people at the NFL network level getting laid off right now. I mean, it is an alarming time to be in this industry. I don't know enough about other industries, though, to say if there is anything that you could be offered in terms of security elsewhere. And it's probably a question that you do want to ask yourself if you consider going into this industry is, can I handle a loss of security? I, for one, as I've talked about, I've gone through a lot in the work industry. I spent a lot of years, really bad workplaces, very toxic coworkers, very toxic bosses and work cultures and bad environments. And it just turned me off so much from, honestly, the world in general. I was very jaded and cynical, and sports really healed me in that way. And being able to just put my emotions into something that at the end of the day, I think that I've been able to talk a little bit more than just sports and make football slightly more important. But at the end of the day, it is just football. And that is just a completely different playing field than what I was doing in the real world for lack of a better term. But I was extremely bored. I felt like I was wasting away. I was never going to be someone that was going to succeed in a 9 to 5 job. And I just really never felt like I found what I was supposed to do. And it just so immediately felt that natural for me with football that I would rather be kind of stumbling along, trying to figure it out as I go, doing what I love, just because of the experiences that I've had kind of growing up. But I don't want to give that kind of blind advice to someone out there, knowing that I probably have a little bit of a cynical opinion on other ways about going in life. And I am also someone that is very comfortable living my life in chaos because I am just a very chaotic person. And I learned a long time ago that it is easier to just roll with the punches than try to gain control and order to a certain extent. And that's just really how I roll. And it works kind of well in this industry. But if there was anything I was kind of be putting out there as my ending of this episode, it would be, I hope to really be inspiring people out there. I hope to see this influx of women fans, especially with Taylor Swift, with the NFL this past offseason. That's something I really hope continues momentum-wise going into this next year, because that just opens up a whole new opportunity for me. But as I've kept speaking to these classes, and I'm going to keep doing so, and I've had these students reach out to me and ask me for advice. And, I don't want to just kind of give the sunshine and rainbows take that, oh, just love what you do and you'll never work a day in your life and, make yourself indispensable. It's all just kind of blah, blah out there. And at the end of the day, you could just get laid off. You could lose your job. But that really applies in any industry. Maybe being raised by an attorney and a paralegal, where I was always kind of prepared for the worst case scenario. But reality is that's life. You could walk outside and get hit by a bus. I've completely lost the plot on what I'm saying on this episode. All that to say, though, sports is scary, and I don't want to give sunshine and rainbow advice out there to someone that, not to say naive. I entered this industry jaded for other reasons. And so I wasn't really going to be naive about anything. I was very skeptical, and I just really didn't expect this to actually work. But you feel like you have nothing to lose, gives you a lot of freedom to operate as a person. That's kind of what I found myself doing. But my advice would be, if you find that you're not happy in what you're doing, then yeah, maybe try something else. Maybe just take a step back and re-examine. I started out by doing writing on the side for one of these blog websites, even if it's a really low grade one, just being able to have a space to work on my writing. And I guess I wrote some Word articles and kept them on Microsoft, but not really. So just having a space to really start that and start creating. And even if it's not about football, I cover soccer. I have been the Jester's PA announcer. I'm going to keep doing that this offseason. As I said before, getting reps in whatever you do, but whatever you end up getting into, find your voice and don't be afraid to use it. And that really goes twofold for the women out there, because at the end of the day, we're never going to have played the sport of football, but so have a lot of people that haven't covered the sport. And there are people that cover every single sport that haven't played them. So I've never really understood that argument. But for me, I feel like I personally have probably overcompensated quite a bit with my football knowledge to make sure that I'm an authority figure in this field. But I don't want that to have to necessarily be the norm. So I hope that I do kind of allow women to feel more comfortable feeling like they can talk about scouting and do that type of analysis. But at the same time, I don't want that to kind of be, well, that's the only way for women to have an authoritative voice in this industry. It's just my pathway that I offer to people out there. But I am going to wrap this up just because I feel like I could keep talking for hours. And, I'm sure people are probably wanting to hear a little more about Tulane and what they plan to do this year. But as I've always said, this is a business about people. And at the end of the day, I am the people behind Before the Whistle. And it just felt like, with a year of this in review, to just sit down, appreciate what I've been able to do and create for you guys this last year. Hope that I can continue to do that in a way that continues to resonate with people and maybe just get that much better at my analysis, my insights, and what I want to provide for you guys. But the support has been incredible. I can't emphasize it enough. Just the DMs that I get from people hearing it in passing while I'm at Tulane practice from people, it does make a difference. And I've always been someone that gives people compliments. And as bad as I am at receiving them, they do mean a lot, and it'll always mean a lot. And this space will always mean a lot. And I am just very grateful for this year on Before the Whistle with you all.